BIDSTITCH gang is out in New York. I'm exhausted. I'm sleep deprived. I'm hungover. I got the jitters, but I'm feeling a little bit better because we are with the one and only Bowiecokemirror. Sam?
Thanks for having me, man. I really appreciate being here.
We're excited.
Happy to be here.
We're excited. You are a star. You're a star in the vintage community.
Well, you know, all I have to say to that is that, you know, it takes one to know one. No, it's great to be here, man.
Well, we're excited to have you, and I think a lot of people have heard of you, but they really haven't heard from you. And I think, first let's start with this.
Yeah, sure.
Bowiecokemirror, where'd you get the name?
I mean, honestly, it was a time when Instagram wasn't that serious.
Okay.
And, you know, there weren't that many vintage, like, people on Instagram. And it was just kind of like a goof and a joke, and I just thought it'd be fun. And I was sitting there like trying to think of a name, and like, you know, there's a Beastie Boys song called Car Thief, and there's a line in it where Ad Rock says Bowiecokemirror, and I always thought that was like mad funny, because I remember like I loved that song, and then I was like reading the lyrics like years ago, and it said Bowiecokemirror. I thought it was like mad funny, so I just thought it'd be like a kind of like a funny like goof like Instagram name. And then
I don't know if you could get away with it today.
Yeah, it was funny because it was like, you know, one of the first like pop-up markets I did, the lady running it, she was like, I don't know about that name, it's not very family friendly. And I was like, what do you mean? I was like, it's a Beastie Boys like rhyme. She was like, oh, I'm sorry. Sorry. But no, it was just a goof, and then it kind of stuck, and then next thing I knew, like people were like started like calling me Bowie. And I was just like, all right.
It's not a bad name.
I guess like that's cool. That's cool. Because it does kind of like, you know, it's like rock, has that kind of like classic like vintage rock, but it's also like got like a hip hop tie-in, I guess. So it's kind of like, I don't know, it works for me, I suppose.
Awesome. So how'd you get into vintage initially, or was your first sort of interest into the fashion space like the traditional streetwear to vintage kind of transition?
Yeah, no, it's interesting you say that because so much of the clothing that I wore as a kid, like really young, I was super into a lot of the emerging brands in the early 90s. And I was living in Boston at the time, and there were a whole bunch of like amazing skate and like counterculture fashion stores, specifically like on Newbury Street. And I was kind of just like that young kid that was always like in this back of the stores, like into the clothing as it came out, seeing a lot of these brands. And to me, that was really like the real like emergence of streetwear. Like that was kind of the first time I had like actually heard that name. And yeah, I was just super into that stuff, into a lot of the graphics. And a lot of those brands at the time, like Fucked and Stussy and like Fresh Drive, were referencing a lot of vintage graphics, specifically like 60s and 70s stuff. So there was a lot of like kind of this cultural like rehashing in the graphics, even to the garments themselves, like ringer t-shirts and like stripes and like funky stuff like that at that time in the early 90s was like really cool. But it was like done in a way where it was worn like very baggy and not necessarily like you'd wear like I could show you like a photo of me like 13 years old and just like a giant like hang 10 striped shirt like hanging down to my knees and stuff like that. And you know, all fast forward like all these decades later, kind of around the same time that I started selling vintage professionally, the 90s became like a very hot like decade. So I just found myself in this like kind of like funny moment where like I finally became the age where like the stuff I wore as a kid was like vintage. And it was like, but it was like sort of like very full circle how those like sort of vintage inspired graphics that I was into as a kid also sort of like informed a lot of, you know, my interest in vintage clothing later on. So
I'm kind of curious, how would you characterize this era, or maybe this year, in terms of vintage selling and buying? Just as a whole, like, what are your kind of thoughts on it?
I mean, I think it's like so individual, and like there's so many ways to approach selling vintage, which you know, is no right or wrong. It's really like what works for you as an individual. So it's very subjective. Obviously there's like more people getting into it all the time. So every year there's just like more people and more stuff being found, and the shows get crazier and more populated. And so for me, like, in this past year and right now specifically, like I've sort of am putting more of a focus back into my showroom experience and making sure that I really have like a good one-on-one customer experience with the people that take the time to see me specifically. And I really value like opportunities where I can have this like unapologetic like creativity and really just do everything that I want to bring. And so I'm very like appreciative of this opportunity and the way that you guys have worked with me in the past, because you've always really given me that creative freedom to do me, in the way that only I can. And especially I feel like with things are becoming so saturated all the time, and like you see so much of the same stuff over and over again, that my MO has always just been to find the unique stuff that really appeals to me and like kind of makes my heart sing. And that's what I've always focused on and have been continuing to focus on. But to more back to your question, like personally I'm a bit more focused on the showroom practice at this point and sort of taken a back seat to the shows. But I think that like the shows have been huge, especially in the last couple years. And it's a great way for people to really like establish themselves and show their curation and stuff like that. But I think that's gotten really saturated. And I'm here for all of it. I just want to make sure that like I'm always in a position where like my creativity isn't stifled by any like barrier. You know what I mean?
Sam, one thing I like about you and this creativity that you're touching on is your very diverse, eclectic sort of tastes. And it's palpable, like the way you talk about music, the way you talk about film. I could tell that you have a very creative sense of taste when it comes to how you're sourcing, the types of items that you're finding, and what you're showcasing and displaying.
Yeah.
What do you attribute that to?
Well, thank you. I really attribute that, again, to just doing what I love and just going for the things that excite me and like really like, in a more like technical sense, I've always said like, every like decade of clothing, I'd say, and probably the last 120 plus years has a certain like cream of the crop kind of like echelon of items that are timeless and valuable based on whether it's a certain design elements, the construction of the garment, or whether there's some kind of like cultural relevance like attached to it. And so those kind of special items of any time frame, that's sort of like the common thread that really gets me excited and keeps me motivated in this business, and also allows me to consistently be successful in different areas of the business, because I'm going for what I think is like really cool. And whether it's like, a super early jacket, or whether it's some kind of graphic that was designed in the last like 10, 15 years, that common thread of that like being like the kind of special item of that time frame is what keeps me like motivated. And then how it sort of makes me successful in a way is that, like, for instance, I'll be like super like in a t-shirt mode, like super passionate about like going hard on tees. And then I'll find that like maybe it gets a little stagnant, and like maybe it starts to get saturated, and I'm seeing the same shirts all the time, and it's like not as exciting. And that allows me to, instead of just like getting lost in the sauce on that side of things, my attention will get grabbed by like, some crazy military stuff, and then I'll sort of switch gears into that lane, or into the like workwear kind of lane, or Western, or whatever it is. And just finding those like super unique, like coveted pieces, that's what gets me motivated. And then, I don't have to like sort of play myself in any factor. And then if it's like, maybe the true vintage side of it is like getting like kind of watered down and like kind of boring, then all of a sudden I'll just like see a t-shirt I've never seen before, or I'll see something else, and it's just like, that's what keeps me going. So I think that's, you know, that's a big part of it, is just constantly going for the rare stuff, and that excites me, and not letting that define any particular era or style. You know what I mean?
Do you think that the current sort of workwear true vintage trend is a response to that type of saturation happening in sort of the greater t-shirt market?
I think so, a little bit. I also feel like that trend is, sort of from my observation, coming from more of a younger demographic.
Yeah.
And I think that some of that may have to play into the fact that, like, you know, when you're young, you're trying to always like reinvent yourself and be cool, you know, and that's like very important to some people. And I think that, like, you know, what you're talking about, from what I've observed, seems to almost be like an evolution of just like young people trying to just like be cool, you know, just like trying to find the next thing. And like, you know, it's like what they love today is like, you know, they might still love it tomorrow, but they pretend they don't. I don't know. It's like, I can't get into just like any like bashing of this or that.
Sure.
It's like, it's all good, you know what I mean? But I think like that's, I mean, I'm a little bit like at a point in life where I just can appreciate a more like vast array of things. So, but yeah, I think that's kind of part of it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that that's sort of I wouldn't say criticism, but it's something that people have taken notice of within that space.
Yeah.
And which kind of leads me to another direction. It's sort of a strange thing that just kind of popped off the top of my head. You were talking about you kind of growing up in the 90s, and then things going full circle, and you seeing, okay, some of this shit's really awesome, and it's what I've been interested in my whole life, and now it's worth money.
Right.
We're seeing something, I don't know if you can call it similar, but I'm seeing shades of it within like the Y2K space that's exponentially growing.
Oh yeah.
Especially with women.
Sure.
And I'm curious if you have any thoughts there.
I mean, you know, I think it's just like a tale as old as time. It's like every, you know, certain period, things sort of come around again and like reinvent themselves. And, you know, certainly going back to what I said earlier, I think even continuing on into this millennium, there's still going to be moments where there's something that really strikes with people and has that cultural relevance, whether it was a certain designer or something, or just a moment in time. So I think it's all good, and like, you know.
Because you see yourself selling it one day.
Yeah, that's true. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, hey, you know, I got my eye open, you know. But yeah, I think the Y2K aesthetic is like cool, because the generation of kids that are really like making that their own, they're not just like cosplaying Y2K. You know, you don't see just like, it's like what I was saying, like with me young in the 90s, there was like a very like a 60s 70s influence. And like I said, like I wasn't dressing like a hippie, but I had like hippied out clothes that I was rocking my own way. And then, like when I see a lot of these, like, you know, I'll go to like Thrift to Death or something like that, and I see these kids, and the way that they're dressed is totally their own thing, with just like you know, but it's clothing from another previous era, you know. So it's like I relate to that. I think it's cool. I think that's just gonna keep evolving. You know what I mean?
Not only do you have a vast array of interests, you also have, given you those interests, a very diverse set of clientele. I'm sure a lot of international buyers, but I'm sure a lot of younger buyers based in the US. What are the trends that you're noticing amongst buyers, both internationally and here in the US, and how do you adjust your selling sort of style or preferences to them?
Damn, that's kind of like that can go pretty deep.
Cool.
Because there's a little like bit of a backstory of how we're even, a lot of American dealers, when you mention international, even approach why and what they sell, and maybe don't even fully understand. You know, my understanding of sort of how we've got to this vintage business that everyone is involved in, especially it's like social media today, really kind of started in the 60s, when the first Japanese buyers started coming here, because in Japan they sort of decided amongst themselves that they wanted to have a culture and a scene of wearing and appreciating American vintage clothing. So a lot of the stuff that's so coveted and that people are looking for and just accept as fact that that's like a lit vintage American piece, don't realize that it only is that because at some point in Japan, they wanted that. They decided that that's what they wanted to come here and buy. And so like...
Do you know why that is?
I just think that it sort of speaks to the Japanese culture historically in, you know, appreciating and adopting, you know, cool, creative, like cultural things from around the world and incorporating it in their own way. And they're very good at doing that. Mm-hmm. And you know, I guess whatever reason, at some point, like 60s, 70s, when they started coming over, buying this stuff, and really like keeping the American sellers in the dark as much as possible, because you know, it's to their benefit. It's their thing.
Yeah, of course.
It's their thing. They say, we want to come over here and buy the stuff as cheap as possible and keep the people selling it in the dark as much as possible, so they don't know what we're buying. They can't even anticipate what we're buying, because the next time they come back, it's something else. And that was very much the way it was for many decades, until now.
What changed?
Social media.
Okay.
And everybody's so online. And I think, like, really, from what I understand, in the pandemic was the first time that with the t-shirt bubble, that was like really the first time that the American market sort of outpriced the Japanese market on a certain category of clothing. But what that has now in turn created is a niche American market of American vintage sellers and collectors selling to each other and maybe taking things that were influenced by what the Japanese wanted at one point and putting their own spin on style and condition and this kind of. So it's almost created now a new American, like a new progressive American market that's within that. And so that puts me in a position where, like, you know, I'm still like running around trying to figure out what the Japanese buyers want, you know, and like.
But doesn't that kind of help you, because now you sort of have two sets of buyers interested in maybe sort of like two or styles of the same thing. Like,
sure.
For example, I've heard Asian buyers mostly prefer like some type of dead stock condition, whereas Americans are still somewhat flexible as to how dead stock they want.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'll give a little game here. You know, it's like basically when it comes to a lot of this workwear, you know, dead stock condition is going to be your optimal price. You know, when it's the right size, the tags, everything, that's the most you're going to be able to get for that piece. And then any kind of iteration of damage or anything going down is just knocking money off until it's like what sometimes I've heard people refer to in Japan as like junk condition. There's kids that they want like crazy thrash stuff, and like there's also people in Japan that want that too, but even then it's like more specifically detailed. Like there's many Japanese terms for each type of fade on a pair of denim, you know what I mean? And like, so that's even more nuanced. But yeah, no, it's just like the kind of freedom and like relaxed kind of approach that a lot of young American vintage collectors take these days does make it easier to sell a lot of like stuff across the board, you know.
Interesting.
For me, which is great.
So like you said previously, it's actually sort of helped you, or at the very least it's rounded out the way in which you sell, because you have these two sets of markets by which you could tap if you need to sell based on condition. Yeah,
well, there's also emerging, you know, the European market is emerging.
Yeah, talk to me about that. Talk to me about the European market.
I'm honestly not too tapped into it. I'd like to be more, obviously, but yeah, no, it's just, but it's just kind of more of what I see and what I observe, and like, it seems like in like Italy and France is like, you know, American military is like super big, and they sort of also have a heritage element with their own workwear French workwear, stuff like that. So it's cool, but you know, me personally, I'm just more interested in American, you know, so that's where more of my focus is. But obviously, you know, it's not just Japan. The Southeast Asian market has always been historically like huge on super rare T-shirts and Levi's and stuff like that. And you know, I have customers in more customers in China and like Taipei and those areas all the time too.
Interesting,
So.
you said that. We've been hearing more about an emerging trend from sort of Chinese buyers tapping into those vintage sort of Americana roots, or even T-shirt game here in the United States. If you could look at the Bowie crystal ball, look 5 years into the future.
Sure.
What kind of trends do you see emerging in vintage?
I mean, that's a good question. I think it, you know, there's a lot of like angles to that. You know, I mean, I've heard people say, you know, just like as the Y2K has like, that's gonna be even more vintage and go like deeper into the like the thing, and then like, you know, it's just gonna keep getting newer, like newer stuff keeps getting older, which again is interesting to see why certain things will be coveted and not, you know, and yeah, but you know, I think it is more gonna be, you know, the important pieces will be more based into cultural relevance versus garment construction.
Interesting.
You know, like you hear the term like fast fashion, right? And that's like a bad thing. And if you trace that back through like workwear, for instance, you know, like the kind of classic workwear as we know it today really started evolving in sort of the late 1800s, mid to late 1800s, and sort of peaked in terms of design and innovation in the 20s and 30s, okay? And then so by like the 40s and 50s, it started to get very generic, and a lot of these really interesting construction details and the reasons why they were there, which were industry based, depending on what part of the country you were in, sort of diminished into this kind of more generic stuff. And then by the 60s, we're into the fast fashion bullshit that we basically have today. So like a lot of that kind of construction stuff is kind of like in the past. I mean, so I think, yeah, I think it's just more of like a moment in time of what's going to be trendy, like what, obviously it's like what people are nostalgic for, but also like, you know, I think we have important designers all the time that are doing stuff.
Interesting.
You know?
So I kind of see what you're saying, I think, which is that like, okay, it's going to be less about the type of the garment being produced due to the advent of fast fashion.
Yeah.
And more about like the cultural sort of relevance behind the item that was created, but under the impression that it's not fast fashion. Maybe like more designer.
Or it just is what it. I mean, you know, the factories and stuff we have now, it just is what it is. You know what I mean? And like, that's wonderful if people can like go back and do sort of like a heritage handmade brand kind of thing. But I think like, yeah, that's sort of it. And then I just think at the same time, old stuff is just gonna like keep getting more expensive.
Yeah.
You know, like I buy newer stuff all the time and like stash it, you know, and like hopes that it's just gonna keep like going up in value. So that's kind of like my take on it. But you know, like
tell us if there was a couple things that you would tell people to start stashing, or things you are currently stashing.
Well,
don't give us the whole sauce, but tell us one or two things.
I'm just gonna say this. You know, I thrift a lot. You know, I'm deep in the thrift stores on a daily basis. Yeah. Okay. And the amount of made in USA Levi's up to the early 2000s are just disappearing. Not like, you know, and the prices have gone up. So if I'm in a thrift store and I see a pair of made in USA Levi's, I don't care what the thrift store price is, I'm buying those, and they're just like they're just going in a pile till further notice.
Take from that what you will. You heard it here from the man, the legend. He's not yet a myth, but
Sheesh.
he's the best. Sam.
Appreciate you, man. Thanks, London.
Man.
Thank you, BIDSTITCH.